What if I told you that the children who grew up inside the White House were not always sweet, obedient kids in old photographs? That some of them started fires in the East Room, smuggled snakes into cabinet meetings, or watched their fathers change the course of history while quietly falling apart behind closed doors? You probably think presidential kids lived charmed, protected lives, safe behind the marble columns and Secret Service smiles. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Many of them lived through tragedy, scandal, addiction, and secrets so strange that historians still argue about them today. These aren't rumors pulled from tabloids. They're documented in letters, diaries, court records, and first-hand accounts left behind by the people who lived them. So before we begin, settle in, dim the lights, get cozy, and let your mind drift, because tonight isn't about jump scares or shocking headlines. It's about slow, strange human stories that history textbooks conveniently left out. And if you enjoyed drifting off to stories the classroom never taught you, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and leave this video a like. It helps these forgotten stories find their way to more curious minds like yours. Now get comfortable, because we're about to walk through 99 secrets about the children who grew up in the shadow of the most powerful house in America. Let's start with a man who seemed almost cursed by history itself. Robert Todd Lincoln. It's the late 1800s, and Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of President Abraham Lincoln, is somehow present, or nearly present, at 3 different presidential assassinations. He was near his father the night Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in 1865. He was invited to accompany President James Garfield the day Garfield was shot in 1881. And decades later, in 1901, he was attending an event with President William McKinley when McKinley was shot as well. 3 presidents, 3 assassinations, one common thread. Robert eventually refused invitations to presidential events entirely, reportedly telling friends there was a certain fatality about presidential functions when he was present. Historians can't fully explain the coincidence, only document it, letter by letter, account by account. It remains one of the eeriest footnotes in presidential family history. A quiet reminder that the children of presidents didn't just witness history. Sometimes they were standing right beside it when it turned tragic. And speaking of presidential children whose stories rarely make it into textbooks, let's go all the way back to the beginning. George Washington's stepchildren. George Washington never had biological children of his own, a fact that quietly shaped much of his personal life. When he married Martha Custis, he became stepfather to her 2 surviving children, John Parke Custis, known as Jackie, and Martha Parke Custis, known as Patsy. Washington took an active role in raising them, managing their inheritance, and worrying over their education. Letters between Washington and tutors reveal a man deeply invested in these children's futures, even referring to their well-being in his private correspondence. He never legally adopted them, but by all accounts treated them as his own. It's a softer side of Washington history books rarely dwell on, a founding father quietly navigating fatherhood without ever holding a child of his own blood. And speaking of children whose lives ended far too soon, Patsy Custis's epilepsy is a story soaked in quiet grief. Washington's stepdaughter suffered from severe epileptic seizures throughout her short life, a condition medicine at the time barely understood. Washington reportedly spent considerable sums seeking treatments, consulting doctors, and trying remedies that ranged from questionable to outright useless. Despite his efforts, Patsy's seizures grew worse. In 1773, at just 17 years old, she collapsed during a seizure at Mount Vernon and died within minutes. Washington's own letters describe his devastation, some historians noting it as one of the few times he expressed such raw personal anguish in writing. Martha was reportedly inconsolable for weeks. Patsy's death remains a haunting reminder that even in one of the wealthiest households in colonial Virginia, medicine simply couldn't save a teenage girl from a disease we now manage with basic prescriptions. And speaking of Custis, children who didn't survive into old age, Jackie Custis at Yorktown tells a story of war brushing right up against family tragedy. Washington's stepson joined the Yorktown campaign in 1781, not as a soldier but as a civilian aide eager to witness the war's final chapter firsthand. Historians describe him as somewhat undisciplined, more interested in status than soldiering, yet Washington allowed him to be present. Shortly after the British surrender, Jackie fell severely ill with what accounts describe as camp fever, likely typhus. He died within weeks, leaving behind a young wife and 4 children. Washington, who had just witnessed the victory that secured American independence, now faced the sudden death of his stepson. He reportedly took in 2 of Jackie's children afterward, quietly extending his role as father once again. And speaking of children Washington helped raise after tragedy struck, Nellie Custis at Mount Vernon became one of the estate's most celebrated figures, as Jackie's daughter Nellie was taken in by George and Martha following her father's death. She grew up surrounded by dignitaries, diplomats, and the constant hum of political life at Mount Vernon. Accounts describe her as a gifted musician and a captivating hostess, someone who could charm foreign visitors with ease. She eventually married Washington's personal secretary, Lawrence Lewis, in a ceremony held at Mount Vernon itself. Nellie's letters, preserved for historians, offer some of the most personal glimpses we have into daily life inside Washington's household, capturing quiet domestic moments far removed from official portraits and formal biographies. And speaking of Custis' children whose legacies stretched into more complicated territory, George Washington Parke Custis built something that would echo far beyond his lifetime. Also raised by George and Martha, he grew up to construct Arlington House, a grand estate overlooking the Potomac. Custis intended it as a living memorial to his adopted grandfather. Decades later, the estate passed to his daughter, whose husband happened to be a Confederate general named Robert E. Lee. The property's grounds eventually became Arlington National Cemetery, a transformation historians still find layered with irony. And speaking of founding families with complicated naming traditions, John Adams's 3 sons carried the weight of generations before they'd even learned to walk. And speaking of quirky presidential moments involving these Adams boys grown into men, John Quincy Adams's White House pet deserves its own chapter. In 1826, the Marquis de Lafayette gifted the president a live alligator, and instead of politely declining, Adams reportedly kept the creature in an East Room bathroom for several months. Visitors to the White House would sometimes be startled to find a reptile lounging in the tub, tail draped over the edge, utterly indifferent to the pomp of the building around it. Some historians debate exactly how long the alligator stayed, and details vary depending on the account, but the story has persisted for nearly 2 centuries as one of the stranger footnotes of early presidential history. Adams, a man known for rigorous discipline and daily cold swims in the Potomac, apparently found nothing odd about housing a large reptile down the hall from cabinet meetings. It's a small, strange detail that rarely makes it into serious biographies, overshadowed by his diplomatic achievements and later congressional career. But it's worth remembering, if only because it humanizes a president often portrayed as stiff and humorless, a man who once shared his home with an alligator and somehow made it work. And speaking of John Quincy Adams refusing to slow down, his congressional career says everything about a man who simply couldn't stop serving. After leaving the presidency in 1829, having lost a bitter re-election fight to Andrew Jackson, most former presidents quietly retired. Adams did not. In 1830, voters in Massachusetts elected him to the House of Representatives, and he held that seat for the next 17 years until his death in 1848. He became one of the most vocal opponents of slavery in Congress, fighting the infamous gag rule that blocked anti-slavery petitions from even being read aloud. Colleagues nicknamed him Old Man Eloquent for his relentless, often blistering speeches. He collapsed on the House floor in February 1848 after suffering a stroke, and died 2 days later in the Speaker's room of the Capitol. Few presidents have returned to lower office after leaving the White House, and even fewer have used that role to build a legacy, arguably as significant as their presidency itself. Adams proved that political relevance doesn't have to end with the highest office, a lesson that feels strangely modern for a man born in the 1760s. And speaking of Adams' sons whose stories took darker turns, Charles Adams's struggles reveal a family grappling with pain far from the public eye. The second son of John and Abigail Adams, Charles showed early promise, studying law and appearing destined for a respectable career. But alcoholism gradually consumed him, and his personal and financial life unraveled through the 1790s. Letters between family members describe growing desperation, missed obligations, and a son increasingly estranged from his parents. By 1800, Charles was living in poverty in New York, his health destroyed by years of heavy drinking. He died that same year at just 30 years old, reportedly of cirrhosis of the liver, leaving behind a wife and 2 young daughters. John and Abigail Adams, both deeply devout and disciplined people, found their son's decline almost impossible to reconcile with their expectations for the family. Abigail rarely spoke of Charles publicly afterward, and his death cast a long, quiet shadow over the Adams household for years. It's a reminder that even America's most prominent political families weren't immune to the kinds of private tragedies that rarely made it into official historical records. And speaking of Adams' children shaped by extraordinary circumstances early in life, Thomas Boylston Adams's diplomatic youth reads almost like an adventure novel. As the youngest son of John and Abigail Adams, Thomas spent much of his adolescence overseas, accompanying his father on diplomatic postings across Europe during the 1780s. While most teenagers of the era were tending farms or apprenticing trades, Thomas found himself navigating royal courts, foreign languages, and the complicated politics of revolutionary France and the Netherlands. He studied alongside his brother John Quincy, absorbing lessons in law and diplomacy that shaped his later career as a lawyer and judge. Historians note that this unusual upbringing gave Thomas a worldliness few Americans possessed at the time, though it also meant long stretches away from a stable home life. Some accounts suggest the constant travel and pressure to succeed weighed heavily on him throughout adulthood. Thomas eventually settled into a quieter legal career in Massachusetts, never quite matching the prominence of his older brother. Still, his early years abroad offer a fascinating glimpse into what it meant to grow up as a founding father's child, caught between childhood and the machinery of international diplomacy before most kids his age had ever left their home colony. And speaking of founding fathers whose family lives were marked by devastating loss, Thomas Jefferson's surviving daughters tell a story soaked in grief. Jefferson and his wife Martha had 6 children together, but only 2 survived into adulthood, a mortality rate tragically common in 18th century America, yet no less painful for the family living through it. Martha, known as Patsy, and Mary, known as Polly, grew up largely without a mother, since Martha Jefferson died in 1782 after the birth of her final child. Jefferson, reportedly shattered by the loss, never remarried and leaned heavily on his surviving daughters for companionship throughout his life. Polly died young too, in 1804, from complications following childbirth, leaving Patsy as Jefferson's only surviving child from his marriage. Some historians note that Jefferson's private letters reveal a man haunted by these repeated losses, even as his public image remained composed and intellectual. The Jefferson household, celebrated today for its architecture and ideas, was also a place shaped by relentless grief, one that modern medicine would likely have prevented, but which colonial families simply had to endure. And speaking of daughters who stepped into roles far beyond what was expected of them, Martha Jefferson Randolph became far more than a grieving father's companion. As Jefferson's only surviving child from his marriage, Martha often served as his hostess, both at Monticello and occasionally in Washington, managing social duties that would typically fall to a first lady. She oversaw household affairs, entertained visiting dignitaries, and helped manage the complicated logistics of running her father's estate, all while raising a large family of her own with her husband, Thomas Mann Randolph. Letters between Jefferson and Martha reveal a close, affectionate relationship, with Jefferson frequently seeking her advice and company throughout his post-presidential years. Some historians argue that Martha's role in shaping Jefferson's domestic life has been underappreciated compared to his political legacy, overshadowed by debates about his public record and private life at Monticello. She remained at her father's side until his death in 1826, one of the last people with him. Her story offers a quieter counterpoint to Jefferson's public image, that of a devoted daughter navigating grief, responsibility, and family obligation in the shadow of one of history's most scrutinized founding fathers. And speaking of Jefferson daughters whose lives took a quieter path than their sisters, Maria Jefferson Eppes's story is often overshadowed by tragedy and time. Known to family as Polly, Maria grew up largely at Monticello, though she also spent significant stretches abroad with her father during his diplomatic years in France, arriving in Paris as a young girl escorted partly by Sally Hemings, then a teenager herself. Maria eventually married her father's cousin, John Wales Eppes, in 1797, a match that kept her within the tight orbit of Virginia's plantation gentry. Letters between Jefferson and Maria suggest a warm, affectionate bond, though some historians note she lived somewhat in the shadow of her more prominent older sister Martha, who took on the bulk of hosting duties at Monticello. Maria's life was cut short in 1804 when she died from complications following childbirth, just 25 years old, another devastating loss for a father who had already buried so much of his immediate family. Jefferson reportedly never fully recovered from Maria's death, and her passing left Martha as his only surviving child. Maria's story rarely receives the attention given to her sister, but it remains a poignant reminder of how fragile life could be for even the most privileged families of the era, no amount of wealth or status offering protection from the dangers of childbirth in early America. And speaking of Jefferson family stories that remain deeply contested among historians, Sally Hemings' children represent one of the most debated chapters in presidential history. Sally Hemings was an enslaved woman at Monticello, and historical evidence including DNA testing conducted in 1998 and extensive documentary research strongly suggests that Jefferson fathered some or all of her children. This conclusion is supported by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation and many historians, though it's worth noting the topic has generated significant debate over the decades, with some questioning aspects of the evidence while acknowledging its overall weight. Hemings had several children who survived into adulthood, and records suggest Jefferson provided them with privileges unusual for enslaved individuals, including eventual freedom, something rarely extended to others at Monticello. The relationship itself, given the vast power imbalance between an enslaved woman and her enslaver, raises complicated ethical questions that historians continue to grapple with rather than treat as a simple footnote. It's a story that complicates the traditional image of Jefferson as purely an Enlightenment thinker and author of the Declaration of Independence. Modern scholarship increasingly treats this history as central rather than peripheral to understanding Jefferson's life, even as some specific details remain genuinely uncertain. And speaking of voices that emerged decades later to reshape historical understanding, Madison Hemings' memoir offered a rare first-hand account from within Monticello's enslaved community. In 1873, a newspaper called the Pike County Republican published an interview with Madison Hemings, one of Sally Hemings' sons, in which he described his life and identified Thomas Jefferson as his father. This account, largely ignored or dismissed by mainstream historians for over a century, provided detailed descriptions of daily life at Monticello, the relationship between Jefferson and Sally Hemings, and the eventual freedom granted to Hemings' children. Madison's testimony included specific details that later corroborated other historical records, lending it credibility that scholars initially failed to grant. For generations, many historians preferred alternative explanations for Sally Hemings' children, often pointing to other Jefferson relatives as more likely fathers. Madison Hemings' own words were largely sidelined in favor of protecting Jefferson's public image. It wasn't until DNA evidence emerged in the late 20th century that his account gained wider historical acceptance. His memoir now stands as one of the most important primary sources for understanding this chapter of Jefferson's life, a reminder that historical truth sometimes waits generations before being taken seriously, particularly when it challenges comfortable narratives about celebrated historical figures. And speaking of descendants who chose to navigate a country still deeply divided by race, Eston Hemings Jefferson's new identity reveals how complicated freedom remained even after emancipation. Easton was the youngest son of Sally Hemings, freed according to Jefferson's will after his death in 1826. He initially settled in Ohio, working as a musician and craftsman, but in the 1850s, Eston and his family made a significant decision, relocating to Wisconsin and adopting the surname Jefferson while choosing to live as white. This shift allowed the family greater social and economic opportunities in a country where racial classification determined nearly every aspect of daily life. Some historians describe this as a pragmatic response to the harsh realities of 19th century American racism rather than any rejection of heritage. Easton's descendants largely maintained this identity for generations, and it wasn't until modern genealogical and DNA research that the broader public reconnected these family lines to Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. The story illustrates how racial identity in America was often fluid, strategic, and shaped by survival rather than fixed biological categories. Easton's choice, whatever his personal reasoning, reflects the impossible position many mixed-race Americans faced, forced to weigh personal safety and opportunity against questions of heritage and truth in a deeply unequal society. And speaking of presidential families dealing with troublesome relatives closer to home, James Madison's stepchildren brought their own set of complications into the White House years. Madison married Dolly Payne Todd, a widow with a young son named John Payne Todd, and raised the boy as his own throughout his political career. Known simply as Payne, the young man received an expensive education and every advantage his stepfather's position could offer. Unfortunately, Payne developed a reputation for irresponsibility that worsened as he grew older, and letters from the period suggest growing frustration within the family over his choices. Despite Madison's efforts to guide him toward a respectable career in law or diplomacy, Payne repeatedly disappointed expectations, drifting between failed ventures and mounting personal troubles. Some historians suggest Madison's own reserved, disciplined temperament made it difficult for him to connect with a stepson who seemed to reject every opportunity handed to him. The relationship, while never entirely broken, remained a persistent source of stress throughout Madison's later years, complicating what might otherwise have been a peaceful retirement at Montpelier. And speaking of financial troubles that quietly drained a founding family's resources, Payne Todd's gambling debts became a burden that followed Dolly Madison long after her husband's death. Payne developed a serious gambling habit that, combined with poor investments and general mismanagement, generated staggering debts throughout his adult life. Dolly, deeply devoted to her son despite his failures, repeatedly intervened to cover his obligations, even as her own financial situation grew increasingly precarious after James Madison died in 1836. She was eventually forced to sell portions of Montpelier and other possessions, including valuable papers and mementos from her husband's political career, just to keep pace with Payne's mounting debts. Some historians describe this period as deeply humiliating for a former First Lady once celebrated for her social grace and influence in Washington. Friends and even Congress eventually stepped in, purchasing James Madison's papers partly as a means of providing Dolly financial relief. Payne's struggles continued largely unresolved, and he outlived his mother, though he never achieved the stability everyone had hoped for. It remains one of the more sobering footnotes in early presidential family history. 19. And speaking of families whose struggles played out far from Washington's political stage, James Monroe's daughter Eliza built a very different kind of reputation during her father's diplomatic years in France. Eliza Monroe spent part of her childhood in Paris while James Monroe served as American minister, and she attended school alongside daughters of French aristocracy, including reportedly a stepdaughter of Napoleon Bonaparte. This early exposure to European high society shaped Eliza into someone known for formal, almost rigid manners once she returned to American social circles. Historians describe her as intelligent but often cold, someone who never quite shed the aristocratic sensibilities she absorbed abroad. When her father became president, Eliza took on significant social responsibilities at the White House, sometimes clashing with Washington's more relaxed Republican customs. Her insistence on French-style etiquette occasionally struck other political families as pretentious or exclusionary, and some accounts suggest she deliberately snubbed rivals during social functions. Whatever the truth behind individual anecdotes, Eliza's European upbringing left a lasting mark on how she carried herself, for better or worse, throughout her adult life. It's a small but telling example of how a president's children could absorb entirely different worldviews depending on where their formative years unfolded, worldviews that didn't always translate smoothly back into American political culture. 20. And speaking of Eliza Monroe's time abroad producing consequences far more serious than social awkwardness, her actions in France reportedly helped save a life during one of the era's darkest political moments. During the tumultuous years following the French Revolution, Adrienne de Lafayette, wife of the Marquis de Lafayette, was imprisoned and facing possible execution. According to historical accounts, young Eliza Monroe, then a schoolgirl in Paris, visited Adrienne in prison, a visible show of American support that some historians believe helped draw attention to her case and contributed to her eventual release. The details of exactly how much influence a teenager could exert on revolutionary France's judicial proceedings remain debated among historians, and the story has likely been embellished over generations of retelling. Still, the broader context is well documented. James Monroe himself worked through diplomatic channels to advocate for the Lafayette family, given the close historical ties between Lafayette and the United States. Whether Eliza's visit was symbolic gesture or a genuine turning point, it became a cherished piece of family lore passed down through Monroe biographies. It's a reminder that presidential children sometimes found themselves swept into extraordinary historical moments simply by virtue of where their families happened to be stationed, long before any of them held office themselves. 21. And speaking of presidential daughters whose personal milestones became public spectacle, Maria Hester Monroe holds a distinct honor in White House history. In 1820, Maria married Samuel L. Gouverneur in a ceremony held inside the White House itself, making it one of the earliest documented weddings to take place there. The event drew significant public curiosity, though details remain relatively sparse compared to later, more thoroughly documented presidential weddings. Some records suggest the ceremony was kept relatively small and private, a deliberate choice that reportedly disappointed segments of Washington society eager for a grand social occasion. This decision reflected ongoing tension between the Monroe family's preference for privacy and the public's growing fascination with the personal lives of America's first families. Maria's marriage connected her to another prominent political family, and her husband later served in various government positions, keeping the couple within Washington's social and political orbit for years afterward. The wedding itself set an early precedent for using the White House as a backdrop for major family milestones, a tradition that later presidential families would embrace far more publicly. Maria's quieter approach stands in contrast to the elaborate celebrations that would eventually define presidential weddings, offering a glimpse of how differently early administrations approached the blending of public office and private family life. 22. And speaking of personal tragedies that unfolded far from American soil, John Quincy Adams and his wife Louisa experienced profound loss during their years serving in Russia. Their daughter, also named Louisa Catherine Adams, died in 1812 at just over a year old, while the family lived in St. Petersburg as part of John Quincy's diplomatic post. The harsh Russian climate, combined with limited medical resources available to American families stationed abroad, made infant mortality a real and constant threat during this period. Letters from Louisa Adams during this time revealed deep grief, and some historians note that the loss profoundly affected her emotional state for years afterward, coloring her already complicated relationship with life in Russia. John Quincy Adams's diplomatic responsibilities offered little room for extended mourning, and the family continued its official duties despite the tragedy. This loss remains a somber footnote often overshadowed by John Quincy's later political achievements. Yet it illustrates the very real human cost that diplomatic postings could exact on presidential families long before anyone involved held the nation's highest office. Infant death was tragically common across all social classes during this era, but for families stationed thousands of miles from familiar support systems, grief carried an added layer of isolation that historical records only partially capture. 23. And speaking of Adams' children whose lives ended under mysterious and troubling circumstances, George Washington Adams met a fate that historians still discuss with considerable caution. In April 1829, George disappeared from a steamboat traveling along Long Island Sound, and his body was later recovered from the water. The official conclusion pointed toward accidental drowning, though the circumstances surrounding his death raised questions that were never fully resolved. George had struggled for years with financial mismanagement, personal instability, and mounting pressure from his father's towering political legacy, factors that some historians believe may have contributed to a state of severe emotional distress before his death. Whether his death resulted from an accident, deliberate action, or something in between remains genuinely uncertain, and responsible historical accounts avoid asserting a definitive answer. John Quincy Adams, who had just left the presidency, was devastated by the loss, and correspondence from the period reflects a family grappling with grief compounded by public scrutiny. George's death serves as a somber illustration of the immense psychological burden placed on presidential children, particularly namesakes expected to carry forward towering political legacies. His story remains one of the more haunting chapters in early presidential family history, a caution against assuming privilege guaranteed anything resembling an easy life. 24. And speaking of Adams' descendants who managed to convert family legacy into sustained public service, Charles Francis Adams built a career that extended the family's political influence well into the 19th century. As the son of John Quincy Adams and grandson of John Adams, Charles Francis carried enormous historical expectations and by most accounts he met them with steady, disciplined competence rather than dramatic ambition. He served in the Massachusetts legislature, ran for vice president on the Free Soil ticket in 1848, and later served as a congressman before becoming one of the most consequential American ministers to Great Britain during the Civil War. His diplomatic skill during that period, particularly in preventing British recognition of the Confederacy, is often cited by historians as a quietly decisive contribution to the Union's ultimate success. Beyond his own achievements, Charles Francis fathered several notable descendants, including historian Henry Adams and diplomat Brooks Adams, ensuring the family's intellectual and political influence extended for generations. Some historians describe the Adams family as America's closest equivalent to a political dynasty during this era, spanning presidents, diplomats, writers, and reformers across multiple generations. Charles Francis Adams's steady, unglamorous competence, rarely as dramatic as his ancestors' achievements, nonetheless helped secure the family's lasting place in American historical memory. 25. And speaking of presidents who expanded their families through adoption rather than biology alone, Andrew Jackson's household included a son who wasn't originally his own by blood. Andrew Jackson Jr. was actually the orphan son of Rachel Jackson's brother, Severin Donaldson, and Andrew and Rachel took him in as an infant and raised him as their own, eventually giving him the Jackson name outright. This wasn't a quiet or half-hearted arrangement either. Andrew Jackson Jr. grew up fully integrated into the family, inherited property, and remained close to his adoptive father throughout Jackson's turbulent political career and eventual presidency. Some historians note that Rachel and Andrew Jackson never had biological children of their own, which likely made this adoption feel less like charity and more like the natural formation of their family unit. The relationship wasn't without complications later in life, as Andrew Jackson Jr. struggled financially and required his father's help, managing debts well into adulthood, but the bond between them remained strong until Jackson's death. It's a reminder that even a president known for his fierce, sometimes brutal political reputation could show remarkable tenderness within his own household. Family for Jackson wasn't strictly defined by bloodline, and this quiet act of adoption reveals a softer dimension to a man history often remembers primarily for war and political combat. 26. And speaking of adoptions that emerged from far more violent circumstances, Andrew Jackson's household included another child whose origins traced directly back to one of the era's bloodiest conflicts. During the Creek War in 1813, Jackson's forces destroyed the Creek village of Tallushatchee, and amid the devastation, soldiers found an orphaned infant boy whose mother had been killed in the fighting. Jackson, reportedly moved by the child's circumstances, decided to bring the boy back to the Hermitage and raise him alongside his own family, naming him Lincoln. Some historical accounts suggest Jackson saw parallels between the orphan child situation and his own difficult childhood, though how much sentiment truly shaped this decision remains genuinely debated among historians given Jackson's broader record regarding Native American policy. Lincoln was raised at the Hermitage with access to education and family life. Though he existed in a complicated social position, neither fully treated as an equal to Jackson's other children, nor entirely excluded from the household. He reportedly expressed interest in military service, and Jackson attempted to secure him a position at West Point, though those plans never came to fruition. Lincoln died young, in his teens, from illness, and Jackson reportedly grieved his loss. The relationship remains a strange and unsettling footnote, complicating simple narratives about a man whose policies caused immense suffering for Native communities. 27. And speaking of presidential children who stepped into supportive political roles after personal tragedy, Martin Van Buren's 4 sons found themselves shouldering responsibilities far beyond typical family duties. Van Buren's wife, Hannah, died in 1819, long before he ascended to the presidency, leaving him a widower, raising 4 boys largely on his own while building one of the era's most formidable political careers. As adults, his sons became deeply involved in supporting their father's political ambitions, serving as advisors, aides, and social representatives throughout his rise to the White House. This level of family involvement wasn't entirely unusual for the period, but the closeness of the Van Buren sons to their father's career suggests a household shaped significantly by the absence of a mother figure and the resulting reliance on filial partnership. Some historians note that Van Buren's ability to maintain such a tight-knit political network partly stemmed from this unusually collaborative family dynamic. Whether by necessity or genuine closeness, the Van Buren sons became fixtures within their father's political world in ways that shaped both his public image and his private support system. It's a quiet example of how personal loss could reshape family roles, turning children into indispensable political partners well before anyone anticipated a presidency at all. 28. And speaking of sons stepping into unexpected domestic roles, Martin Van Buren's eldest son Abraham took on responsibilities inside the White House that would typically have belonged to a first lady. Since Van Buren remained a widower throughout his presidency, official hosting duties fell to Abraham and his wife, Angelica Singleton Van Buren, who effectively filled the ceremonial role usually occupied by a president's spouse. Angelica, reportedly polished and socially skilled, took her responsibilities seriously, and some accounts suggest she modeled her approach to White House entertaining on European court customs she'd observed during earlier travels. This arrangement occasionally drew criticism from political opponents, who accused the Van Buren White House of adopting airs of aristocratic pretension unsuited to a republic still wary of anything resembling royal excess. Whether these criticisms reflected genuine concern or simple political opportunism remains debated, but the perception stuck and became a talking point used against Van Buren during his re-election struggles. Abraham, for his part, remained a steady presence throughout his father's presidency, managing both personal and political responsibilities without much public controversy attached directly to himself. It's a curious example of how presidential families adapted to unconventional circumstances, filling institutional gaps left by loss with whatever combination of family members happened to be available and willing. 29. And speaking of presidents whose family size reflected the demanding realities of 19th century domestic life, William Henry Harrison and his wife Anna raised an extraordinarily large family even by the standards of their era. Together, they had 10 children, a number that required significant financial and logistical management long before Harrison ever considered a run for national office. Anna Harrison, known for her deep religious faith and steady household management, reportedly shouldered much of the day-to-day responsibility for raising the children, particularly given Harrison's frequent absences during his military and political career. Some historians note that the sheer size of the family created ongoing financial strain, a pressure that followed Harrison throughout much of his adult life and influenced several of his career decisions. Despite the challenges, the Harrison household became a foundation for a family name that would echo through American politics for generations afterward. Harrison's presidency itself lasted only 31 days due to his sudden death, meaning most of his children experienced their father's political rise and immediate loss within a remarkably compressed time frame. It's easy to focus on Harrison's brief presidency and overlook the decades of demanding family life that preceded it, but raising 10 children in this era was its own kind of enduring, quietly significant accomplishment. 30. And speaking of family ties that stretched across generations of American presidential history, William Henry Harrison's son John Scott Harrison holds a genuinely unique distinction within the nation's political story. John Scott Harrison was both the son of a sitting president and, decades later, the father of another one, Benjamin Harrison, making him the only individual in American history to occupy both roles simultaneously across generations. Unlike his father and son, John Scott Harrison never sought the presidency himself, instead building a quieter career as an Ohio farmer and later serving in Congress. Some historians suggest this relatively modest path suited him personally, allowing the family's political legacy to skip a generation before re-emerging with his son Benjamin's eventual election in 1888. Oddly enough, John Scott Harrison's death in 1878 became notorious for reasons entirely unrelated to politics, when his body was discovered to have been stolen by grave robbers and sold to a medical college, a scandal that briefly overshadowed his quieter historical significance. Despite that macabre footnote, his true legacy remains his singular genealogical position within presidential history. It's a strange, almost overlooked distinction, standing at the exact midpoint between two presidencies separated by nearly half a century of American political change. 31. And speaking of presidential families that grew far beyond typical 19th century norms, John Tyler holds a record that remains unmatched in American history. Tyler fathered 15 children across 2 marriages, more than any other president before or since. His first wife, Letitia, bore him 8 children before her death, and after remarrying a much younger woman, Julia Gardiner, Tyler had 7 more. Managing a household of this size required considerable financial and logistical effort, and some historians note that Tyler's later years were shaped significantly by the demands of supporting such an enormous family. The age gap between his oldest and youngest children was substantial enough that his firstborn and his lastborn belonged to entirely different generational experiences within the same household. Tyler's personal life often gets overshadowed by his contentious political legacy, particularly his post-presidency alignment with the Confederacy, but the sheer scale of his family remains a genuinely remarkable footnote. Raising 15 children in an era without modern conveniences was an achievement of logistics as much as biology. It's easy to focus on Tyler's brief and controversial presidency, but his domestic life quietly set a record that no other president has come close to matching. 32. And speaking of children whose lifespans stretched improbably far into the future, John Tyler's son Lyon Gardner Tyler became a striking example of how presidential lineage could bridge distant historical eras. Born in 1853, decades after his father's presidency had ended, Lyon lived until 1935, meaning a man whose father served under Andrew Jackson's shadow personally witnessed the rise of automobiles, radio, and early aviation. Lyon went on to become a respected historian and served as president of the College of William and Mary, dedicating much of his professional life to studying the very historical period his father had helped shape. Some historians note that Lyon's scholarly work occasionally reflected a protective interest in defending his father's legacy, particularly regarding Tyler's later support for secession. Despite that potential bias, his contributions to historical scholarship were substantial and respected within academic circles of his time. The gap between Lyon's birth and his father's political career illustrates just how unusually elastic presidential family timelines could become. It's a strange, almost dizzying reminder that presidential history isn't always as distant as it appears, sometimes connected by a single long lifespan stretching improbably across generations of American change. 33. And speaking of family timelines that stretched even further than expected, John Tyler's pattern of late fatherhood produced a genealogical oddity that continued into remarkably recent history. Because Tyler himself fathered children well into old age, and because at least one of his sons repeated that pattern, reports have circulated suggesting that Tyler had living grandsons well into the 21st century. This claim, while striking, deserves some caution, as it relies on unusually delayed generational spacing that, while documented, can sound almost too improbable to be true at first glance. Genealogical researchers have generally supported the basic outline of this extended lineage, even if exact details occasionally vary between sources. If accurate, it means a man born in 1790, whose political career predated the Civil War entirely, had direct descendants alive during the era of smartphones and social media. Some historians point to this as one of the more astonishing examples of how presidential family trees can stretch human memory across time in ways that feel almost fictional. It's a reminder that history isn't always as neatly separated into distant eras as we tend to assume, sometimes connected by nothing more than a handful of long, overlapping lifespans. 34. And speaking of presidential children who stepped into official duties during moments of family hardship, Letitia Tyler Semple took on responsibilities inside the White House that circumstances forced upon her at a young age. After John Tyler's first wife suffered a debilitating stroke that left her largely unable to perform public duties, their daughter Letitia stepped in to manage many of the ceremonial and hostess responsibilities typically expected of a first lady. This wasn't a role she'd been groomed for extensively, but she reportedly handled the pressure with composure, overseeing social events and formal gatherings, while her mother remained largely out of public view. Some historians note that this arrangement reflected a broader pattern among 19th century presidential families, where illness or absence often required children to quietly absorb responsibilities well beyond their years. Letitia's efforts allowed the Tyler White House to maintain a semblance of normal social function despite the private difficulties unfolding behind closed doors. Her mother passed away during Tyler's presidency, making Letitia's contributions even more significant during an emotionally difficult period for the family. It's a quiet example of how presidential households often relied on children to preserve public appearances during private struggles that history rarely gives much attention. 35. And speaking of presidents whose family structure looked strikingly different from their predecessors, James K. Polk and his wife Sarah had no children of their own throughout their marriage. While the exact reasons remain unknown and were rarely discussed publicly during their lifetimes, the couple reportedly channeled significant energy into caring for various younger relatives, including nieces, nephews, and other family members who spent extended time within their household. Sarah Polk, known for her sharp intellect and active involvement in her husband's political career, seemed to find purpose in these family relationships, despite lacking biological children herself. Some historians note that the couple's childless household may have allowed Sarah more freedom to engage directly in Polk's political affairs, effectively acting as an informal advisor during his presidency. Whether this arrangement was born from choice or circumstance remains speculative, but the closeness the Polks maintained with extended family suggests they found meaningful ways to build a sense of household warmth regardless. Their marriage is often remembered as one of mutual partnership, with Sarah's political engagement standing out as unusually significant for a first lady of that era. It's a reminder that family in the traditional sense could take different shapes even within the historically rigid structure of the presidency. 36. And speaking of presidential children, whose personal choices intersected dramatically with future political history, Zachary Taylor's daughter, Sarah Knox Taylor, made a marriage decision that would echo far beyond her own lifetime. Sarah fell in love with a young Army officer named Jefferson Davis, who would later become President of the Confederate States during the Civil War. Zachary Taylor reportedly opposed the marriage initially, uneasy about his daughter marrying into the demanding and uncertain life of a military officer stationed far from family support. Despite his objections, Sarah and Jefferson Davis married in 1835, beginning a life together that unfortunately proved tragically short. Just 3 months after the wedding, Sarah contracted malaria while visiting relatives in Louisiana and died at only 21 years old. Davis was reportedly devastated by her death, and some historians suggest the loss profoundly shaped his emotional guardedness in the years that followed. It's a strange historical footnote that a future Confederate president was, for a brief period, the son-in-law of a future United States president. Sarah's brief life connects two significant historical figures in a way that feels almost too coincidental, yet remains a documented and quietly fascinating piece of presidential family history. 37. And speaking of tragedies that reshaped the personal lives of men who would later become historically significant, Sarah Knox Taylor's death deserves a second look beyond her connection to Jefferson Davis. Sarah, the daughter of Zachary Taylor, married Davis in 1835 despite her father's reservations about military life, and within 3 months, she contracted malaria while staying with relatives in Louisiana. She died at just 21, leaving her young husband devastated in a way that some historians believe permanently altered his emotional temperament. Zachary Taylor, who would later become president himself, reportedly carried guilt over his initial opposition to the marriage, wondering if a different outcome might have kept his daughter closer to home and away from the illness that claimed her. The tragedy occurred years before Taylor's own political rise, meaning he entered the presidency already having endured significant personal loss within his family. Sarah's brief life is often reduced to a historical footnote about her husband's later infamy, but her death represents a genuine family tragedy that shaped a father's private grief long before the public ever knew his name. It's a quiet reminder that presidential biographies often contain personal sorrows that predate the political careers we remember them for, sorrows that rarely make it into textbooks. 38. And speaking of daughters who quietly stepped into demanding roles without much historical recognition, Mary Elizabeth Bliss took on White House hostess duties during her father Zachary Taylor's presidency, under circumstances that reflected her mother's discomfort with public life. Margaret Taylor, unlike many first ladies before or since, reportedly avoided the social spotlight almost entirely, preferring privacy over the ceremonial obligations expected of a president's wife. Some historians suggest her reluctance stemmed from exhaustion after years of following her husband through remote military postings, leaving her with little appetite for Washington's social demands. Into that gap stepped Mary Elizabeth, who managed formal dinners, receptions, and the countless social expectations that came with her father's sudden rise to the presidency. She reportedly handled these responsibilities with poise, ensuring that the Taylor White House maintained an appropriate public presence despite her mother's near-total absence from those duties. This arrangement wasn't unique among presidential families of the era, but it highlights how frequently daughters were expected to absorb responsibilities that fell outside their mother's comfort or willingness. Mary Elizabeth's contributions rarely receive much historical attention, overshadowed by her father's short and eventful presidency, but her role in maintaining the household's public function deserves a bit more recognition than it usually gets. 39. And speaking of presidential daughters whose lives ended far too soon after their fathers left office, Abby Fillmore's story carries a particular sadness that often gets lost in the broader narrative of her father's presidency. Millard Fillmore's daughter reportedly served as an intelligent and socially capable presence within the family, and some accounts suggest she assisted with various household and social responsibilities during her father's time in the White House. After Fillmore's presidency ended, Abby's life took a tragic turn when she contracted cholera, an illness that spread rapidly and claimed victims with little warning during outbreaks of that era. She died at only 22 years old, shortly after her father had left public office, meaning Fillmore's transition away from the presidency was almost immediately followed by devastating personal loss. Historians note that Fillmore, already navigating a difficult post-presidential period marked by political uncertainty, was reportedly deeply affected by his daughter's sudden death. The timing of her passing meant Fillmore experienced grief privately, away from the public attention that once surrounded his family during his time in office. Abby's story remains a quiet, somewhat overlooked reminder that presidential families often face the same unpredictable tragedies as any other household of the period, regardless of the political prominence they once held. 40. And speaking of presidential children, who dedicated themselves to preserving their father's legacy rather than pursuing political ambitions of their own, Millard Powers Fillmore chose a quieter path centered on law and historical preservation. Rather than seeking public office or political influence, Fillmore's son built a career as a practicing lawyer, reportedly maintaining a reputation for careful, methodical work throughout his professional life. Alongside his legal career, Millard Powers took on the responsibility of organizing and preserving documents connected to his father's presidency, ensuring that records from that administration weren't lost or scattered after Fillmore's political relevance faded. Some historians credit these preservation efforts with helping later researchers access materials that might otherwise have disappeared, given how inconsistently presidential records were maintained during that era. This role required patience and discipline rather than public recognition, reflecting a son who seemed more interested in protecting historical accuracy than in claiming any personal spotlight. Millard Powers never sought the kind of visibility his father once held, choosing instead a behind-the-scenes contribution to how history would eventually remember the Fillmore presidency. It's a subtle but meaningful example of how presidential children sometimes shaped historical memory, not through fame, but through quiet, careful stewardship of records that future generations would come to rely on. 41. And speaking of personal tragedies that struck presidents just before they assumed the nation's highest office, Franklin Pierce's family endured an almost unimaginable loss weeks before his inauguration. In January 1853, Pierce, his wife Jane, and their 11-year-old son Benny were traveling by train when a devastating accident occurred, resulting in Benny's death right before his parents' eyes. The tragedy left both parents shattered, and some historians argue that Pierce never fully recovered emotionally, entering the presidency under a cloud of grief that shaped his demeanor throughout his term. Jane Pierce reportedly withdrew from public life almost entirely, spending much of her time in mourning rather than participating in the ceremonial duties typically expected of a First Lady. Pierce himself, according to several historical accounts, struggled with the weight of assuming national leadership so soon after such a personal catastrophe. Some historians speculate that this profound loss contributed to the emotional distance and quiet demeanor Pierce displayed throughout his presidency, though such psychological assessments remain speculative given the limits of historical evidence. It's a sobering reminder that presidential transitions weren't always marked by celebration and optimism, and that Pierce's rise to the nation's highest office was overshadowed almost immediately by devastating personal sorrow that never fully lifted. 42. And speaking of presidencies that began under the weight of complete family loss, Franklin Pierce entered the White House having already lost all three of his children, none of whom survived into adulthood. Two of his sons died in early childhood before Pierce's political career reached its peak, and the third, Benny, died in the train accident just weeks before his father's inauguration. This meant Pierce and his wife Jane stepped into the presidency with no living children, a circumstance that shaped the emotional atmosphere of their time in the White House. Jane Pierce reportedly viewed her husband's political rise with a sense of dread rather than pride, partly believing that political ambition had somehow contributed to their family's suffering. The White House during Pierce's presidency often felt subdued, marked by private grief rather than the public confidence usually associated with a new administration. Some historians argue that this profound loss influenced Pierce's leadership style, contributing to the passive and withdrawn approach that critics of his presidency later pointed to. It's a somber historical footnote that one of the least remembered presidencies began under some of the heaviest personal grief any presidential family has endured. Entering office already emptied of the very children a new administration might otherwise have celebrated. 43. And speaking of presidents who never had children of their own, but still found ways to bring family into the White House, James Buchanan remains the only lifelong bachelor to serve as president, and he filled the void of a traditional first family by raising his orphaned niece, Harriet Lane. After both of her parents died when she was young, Harriet was taken in by her uncle, who reportedly treated her with genuine affection and ensured she received an excellent education befitting someone who would eventually take on significant public responsibilities. By the time Buchanan reached the White House in 1857, Harriet had grown into a poised young woman capable of serving as his official hostess, a role she embraced with what many historians describe as remarkable skill for someone still in her 20s. She managed state dinners, diplomatic receptions, and the countless social obligations that came with representing the nation's executive mansion, all while her uncle navigated one of the most turbulent political periods in American history. Some historians suggest Harriet's popularity with the public may have even softened perceptions of an otherwise embattled administration. Her presence gave the Buchanan White House a warmth that the bachelor president alone likely couldn't have provided, proving that presidential families don't always follow conventional definitions. 44. And speaking of presidential relatives whose influence extended well beyond their time in the White House, Harriet Lane's story didn't end when her uncle's presidency did. In the years following James Buchanan's single term, Harriet continued engaging in charitable work, and some historical accounts connect her efforts to causes aligned with the growing humanitarian movement that would eventually include the American Red Cross. Though details about the precise nature of her involvement vary across sources, her broader legacy of philanthropy is well documented, particularly her later contributions toward children's welfare and medical care. After personal tragedies of her own, including the loss of her husband and both of her sons, Harriet reportedly channeled her grief into supporting causes meant to help other families avoid similar suffering. She donated funds that eventually contributed to the establishment of a children's hospital, reflecting a shift from her earlier role as a glamorous White House hostess into someone dedicated to quieter humanitarian work. Her life illustrates how presidential relatives sometimes carry forward a sense of public service long after the political spotlight fades, using personal loss as motivation for lasting contributions to public welfare, even if historical memory tends to focus mostly on her earlier, more visible years inside the Buchanan administration. 45. And speaking of presidents whose personal lives were marked by devastating loss even as they carried the nation through its darkest chapter, Abraham Lincoln and his wife Mary endured heartbreak that rivaled the national tragedy unfolding around them. The couple had 4 sons together, yet only one, Robert Todd Lincoln, lived long enough to reach adulthood. Their first son, Edward, died before turning 4, years before Lincoln's presidency began, while their youngest, Tad, would eventually die at 18, shortly after his father's assassination. The middle son, Willie, died during Lincoln's presidency itself, adding profound grief to an administration already burdened by civil war. Historians often note that Mary Lincoln's mental health struggles in later years may have been deeply connected to the cumulative trauma of losing so many children in such a short span of time. Abraham Lincoln, meanwhile, reportedly carried his own quiet grief while continuing to manage the immense pressures of leading a divided nation. The Lincoln family's personal suffering rarely receives as much attention as the political events of the era, but it remains a sobering reminder that even history's most consequential leaders faced private sorrows that mirrored the larger tragedies unfolding across the country they were trying to hold together. 46. And speaking of losses that struck a presidential family in the middle of an already unimaginable national crisis, 11-year-old Willie Lincoln died inside the White House in February 1862, likely from typhoid fever linked to contaminated water sources that plagued Washington at the time. Willie was reportedly considered one of the brightest and most affectionate of the Lincoln children, and his death devastated both of his parents in ways that visibly altered their demeanor during the following months. Mary Lincoln reportedly could not bring herself to attend the funeral, retreating into a grief so severe that she avoided the room where Willie died for the remainder of their time in the White House. Abraham Lincoln, according to several accounts, wept openly, a rare display of vulnerability from a president otherwise known for composure under pressure. Some historians suggest that Willie's death happened during one of the bloodiest periods of the Civil War, forcing Lincoln to manage a devastating personal loss and unprecedented national crisis simultaneously, though the emotional toll on his leadership remains a matter of historical interpretation. The tragedy remains one of the more haunting episodes connected to the Lincoln presidency, a private sorrow playing out quietly within a house otherwise consumed by the weight of a nation at war. 47. And speaking of presidential children who brought unexpected lightness into households burdened by extraordinary responsibility, young Tad Lincoln became known for his free-spirited presence throughout the White House during his father's presidency. Tad reportedly had a speech impediment and reduced formal schooling due to his father's indulgence, allowing him considerably more freedom to roam the halls than most children in his position might have experienced. He was known for interrupting official meetings, staging mock military drills with visiting soldiers, and even setting up a small tent on the White House lawn during the war, treating the presidential grounds as something between a playground and a personal stage. Cabinet members and staff reportedly tolerated his antics with surprising patience, partly because Lincoln himself seemed to find comfort in his youngest son's unpredictable energy during such an emotionally exhausting presidency. Some historians view Tad's behavior as a rare source of relief for Lincoln, offering brief moments of levity amid the relentless pressures of Civil War leadership. Tad's presence added an unusual warmth to an otherwise somber wartime household, illustrating how even amid national crisis, ordinary childhood behavior found its way into the halls of power in ways that occasionally softened the weight of the presidency itself. 48. And speaking of presidential children who went on to build significant careers of their own, Robert Todd Lincoln stands out as the only one of Lincoln's sons to survive into adulthood, eventually carving out a prominent public career that extended well beyond his father's legacy. After serving briefly during the final months of the Civil War, Robert pursued a career in law before entering public service as Secretary of War under Presidents Garfield and Arthur. He later served as the United States Minister to Great Britain, representing American diplomatic interests during a period of expanding global influence. Robert reportedly carried the emotional weight of his family's tragedies throughout his life, having witnessed the assassinations of his father, and according to some accounts, being present or nearby during 2 other presidential assassinations later in his career, a coincidence that unsettled him deeply. Despite his professional accomplishments, Robert often avoided discussing his father's legacy publicly, reportedly finding the constant comparisons and historical scrutiny exhausting. His life illustrates a rare case of a presidential child achieving substantial success in government while quietly managing the immense personal burden of being the last surviving member of one of history's most scrutinized families. 49. And speaking of Robert Todd Lincoln's unsettling connection to presidential tragedy, historians have long noted the strange coincidence that placed him at or near 3 separate presidential assassinations. He was, of course, closely connected to his father's death in 1865, arriving at the scene shortly after the shooting. 16 years later, Robert was actually present at the train station in 1881 when President James Garfield was shot by an assassin, having arrived to meet the president for a scheduled trip. Then in 1901, Robert was invited to attend the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, where President William McKinley was shot just as Robert was arriving on the grounds. Some accounts suggest Robert became so unnerved by the pattern that he reportedly declined future invitations involving sitting presidents, joking darkly that his presence seemed to invite disaster. Historians debate how much weight to give these coincidences, since correlation isn't causation, but the pattern remains one of the eerier footnotes of presidential history. Robert never sought this grim distinction, and by most accounts he found the association deeply uncomfortable rather than remarkable. His life stands as a strange historical curiosity, a son forever tied to tragedy despite building a respected career entirely separate from those devastating moments. 50. And speaking of presidential sons whose personal struggles played out largely behind closed doors, Andrew Johnson's son Robert took on the role of his father's private secretary during a presidency already defined by political turmoil. Robert Johnson had studied law and briefly served in political roles before his father's ascension to the presidency following Lincoln's assassination, and he seemed positioned to be a trusted aide during an especially contentious administration. However, historical accounts suggest Robert struggled significantly with alcoholism throughout much of his adult life, a battle that reportedly affected his ability to reliably support his father during the demanding responsibilities of the role. Some historians note that Andrew Johnson, dealing with impeachment proceedings and a deeply divided Congress, had little bandwidth to manage his son's personal difficulties alongside the political firestorm surrounding his presidency. Robert's health continued declining after his father left office, and he died just a few years later, still a relatively young man. His story rarely receives much attention compared to the dramatic political battles of his father's presidency, but it offers a quieter glimpse into how personal hardship often existed alongside the public struggles of a presidential family already under immense scrutiny from a nation still healing from civil war. 51. And speaking of Andrew Johnson's sons who took on unofficial roles within his administration, Andrew Johnson Jr., sometimes referred to as Frank, pursued a career in journalism before eventually stepping in to help his father in matters requiring a trusted private hand. Though younger than his brother Robert, Andrew Jr. reportedly worked for a period as a newspaper writer, gaining experience that some accounts suggest influenced his approach when he later served in a private secretarial capacity for his father. Details about his specific journalistic career remain somewhat limited in historical records, though he was known to have edited or contributed to a local publication before returning to more direct involvement in the Johnson family's affairs. His work as a private secretary reportedly involved managing correspondence and administrative matters during a presidency defined by conflict with Congress and the aftermath of the Civil War. Because so much attention during Johnson's presidency focused on impeachment and Reconstruction politics, the contributions of his sons often go unmentioned in mainstream historical narratives. Andrew Jr.'s blend of journalism and quiet administrative support illustrates how presidential children sometimes filled essential but understated roles, helping their fathers manage the mounting pressures of an office that, in Johnson's case, nearly ended in his removal from power entirely. 52. And speaking of presidential sons who ventured into the world of high finance with mixed results, Ulysses S. Grant's eldest son, Ulysses Jr., known widely as Buck, pursued a career in business following his father's presidency. Buck eventually entered banking, co-founding a Wall Street firm alongside a financier named Ferdinand Ward, a partnership that initially seemed promising given the Grant family name's prestige. However, Ward turned out to be running an elaborate Ponzi scheme, and when the firm collapsed in 1884, it took much of the Grant family's fortune with it, including funds belonging to former President Grant himself. Some historians describe the scandal as one of the more devastating financial betrayals experienced by a presidential family, leaving Grant nearly destitute in his final years. Buck reportedly carried guilt over his role in bringing his father into the disastrous partnership, and the episode contributed to the elder Grant's decision to write his memoirs as a way to recover financially before his death. While Buck's later business ventures were more modest, this early chapter remains one of the more sobering examples of how presidential children's financial dealings could carry consequences reaching well beyond their own personal circumstances, entangling their famous parents in genuine hardship. 53. And speaking of Grant children who sought fortune through more adventurous means, Jesse Grant pursued various business ventures throughout the American West, including mining interests in California during a period when such investments carried significant risk and equally significant potential reward. Jesse reportedly attempted to capitalize on his family name to secure investment opportunities, though historical accounts suggest his ventures met with inconsistent success at best. Mining investments during this era were notoriously volatile, with fortunes made and lost based on unpredictable ore discoveries and market fluctuations, and Jesse's experience reportedly reflected these larger industry patterns rather than any particular business acumen or its absence. Some accounts note he also explored opportunities in real estate and other speculative business dealings throughout his life, continuing a pattern common among presidential children who tried translating their family's fame into financial opportunity with varying degrees of success. Jesse's pursuits, while less dramatically catastrophic than his brother Buck's Wall Street disaster, illustrate a broader theme among Gilded Age presidential offspring who often found themselves drawn toward ambitious, sometimes risky business ventures. His life offers a quieter but still telling example of how the Grant children navigated a world eager to capitalize on their father's legacy, for better or worse. 54. And speaking of presidential children whose personal milestones captured the nation's imagination, Nellie Grant's wedding in 1874 became one of the most publicly celebrated events held inside the White House during the 19th century. The ceremony, held in the East Room, attracted enormous media attention, with newspapers across the country covering every detail from her elaborate gown to the decorations adorning the mansion for the occasion. Thousands of Americans reportedly sent gifts, letters, and well wishes, treating the event almost like a national celebration rather than a private family affair. Some historians note that the public fascination with Nellie's wedding reflected a growing cultural interest in presidential families as symbols of American life, foreshadowing the intense media coverage that would later surround future first families. Despite the grandeur surrounding the event, Nellie's marriage reportedly did not lead to the happiness many had hoped for, as her husband was later described in various accounts as unfaithful and difficult, leading to significant personal struggles for her in the years that followed. The dazzling public spectacle of the wedding stood in stark contrast to the quieter hardships that followed, offering an early example of how the public's fascination with presidential families often overlooked more complicated realities behind the celebration. 55. And speaking of presidential children born under unusual circumstances, Ulysses S. Grant's youngest son, Jesse Root Grant, entered the world while his father was stationed on military duty in Missouri, years before the elder Grant would rise to national prominence during the Civil War. At the time of Jesse's birth, Grant was still working through the early uncertain chapters of his career, having left the Army once already, and struggling to establish financial stability for his growing family. Some historians note that Jesse's arrival came during one of the more modest and difficult periods of his father's life, long before wealth, fame, or the presidency were even remotely on the horizon. This context is often overlooked when discussing Jesse, since most accounts of his life focus instead on his later ventures in business and mining out west. Yet his early beginnings offer a quieter reminder that the Grant family's eventual rise to the White House followed years of hardship and instability. Jesse's birth in Missouri stands as a small but telling detail, illustrating how even the most storied presidential families often began their journeys in far humbler and more uncertain settings than history typically remembers. 56. And speaking of presidential children who brought unexpected liveliness into the White House, Rutherford B. Hayes's sons reportedly filled the mansion with energy rarely associated with the relatively reserved Hayes administration. Accounts suggest the boys kept various pets around the White House grounds, adding a sense of playful chaos to an otherwise formal setting during a presidency focused heavily on post-Reconstruction politics. Some records describe the sons engaging in lighthearted pranks, occasionally testing the patience of White House staff who were unaccustomed to such youthful mischief within the historic residence. While detailed accounts of these antics vary in reliability, the general impression left by historians is one of a household that balanced political seriousness with genuine family warmth. The Hayes family, known for its emphasis on temperance and moral respectability, apparently still allowed room for youthful exuberance behind closed doors. This blend of formality and lightheartedness offers a more human glimpse into a presidency, often remembered primarily for its contested election and reform efforts. The sons' antics, though minor in the broader scope of history, remind us that even amid weighty national matters, ordinary childhood mischief still found its way into the White House halls. 57. And speaking of presidential children whose lives were marked by prolonged illness rather than public mischief, Rutherford Hayes's daughter Fanny experienced significant health struggles that reportedly affected her spine for years before her death at just 21. Details about the exact nature of her condition remain somewhat limited in historical records, though accounts suggest it caused ongoing pain and physical limitations throughout much of her short life. Despite these challenges, Fanny was remembered fondly within the Hayes family, and her father in particular was said to be deeply affected by her prolonged suffering. Some historians note that Fanny's illness placed a quiet strain on the family even during years when Hayes was navigating the demanding responsibilities of the presidency. Unlike many public narratives that focus solely on political achievements, Fanny's story highlights the private hardships presidential families often endured away from public view. Her death, occurring after years of declining health, was described by those close to the family as a profound personal loss. Fannie Hayes's life, though brief and largely overshadowed by more prominent historical events, serves as a somber reminder that even families in the national spotlight face deeply personal struggles rarely acknowledged in traditional history books. 58. And speaking of presidential families balancing joy with heartbreak, James and Lucretia Garfield raised a household of 7 children, though only 5 survived into adulthood, a reality all too common for families of that era. Childhood illness during the late 19th century claimed countless young lives regardless of social status, and the Garfield family was not spared from this harsh reality despite their prominence. Historical accounts suggest the surviving Garfield children grew up in a household that valued education and public service, values instilled largely by their parents' own backgrounds in teaching and civic engagement. Some historians note that James Garfield, despite his demanding political career, maintained close involvement in his children's upbringing whenever possible. The losses the family experienced were rarely discussed publicly, reflecting broader societal norms of the time that often kept such grief private. Yet these quiet tragedies undoubtedly shaped the family's dynamic long before Garfield's presidency, and certainly long before his assassination reshaped their lives entirely. The Garfield household, marked by both loss and resilience, offers a reminder that even families destined for national prominence were not immune to the widespread hardships facing ordinary American families during this challenging historical period. 59. And speaking of presidential milestones intertwined with tragedy, James Garfield's daughter Molly was married in the White House just months after her father's assassination, transforming what might have been a joyous occasion into one layered with grief. Some accounts suggest the wedding proceeded partly out of respect for prior plans made before Garfield's death, while others note the family found solace in honoring a moment of happiness during an otherwise devastating period. The ceremony reportedly carried a somber undertone, with mourning still fresh throughout the household and the nation still processing the loss of a president who had served only a matter of months. Historians note that such public milestones occurring so soon after tragedy were unusual, reflecting the complicated balance the Garfield family faced between public expectation and private sorrow. Molly's wedding remains a poignant example of how presidential families often navigated deeply personal moments under intense public scrutiny, even amid profound loss. The event, quietly significant in historical memory, illustrates the resilience required of families thrust suddenly into national mourning while still attempting to preserve some semblance of normal family life. 60. And speaking of presidential children who carried their father's legacy into future administrations, James Rudolph Garfield, son of the assassinated president, went on to serve as Secretary of the Interior under President Theodore Roosevelt. His appointment reflected both his own qualifications and the enduring respect many held for the Garfield family name decades after James Garfield's brief presidency ended in tragedy. Historians note that James R. Garfield became known for supporting conservation efforts during his tenure, aligning closely with Roosevelt's broader environmental agenda. His career demonstrated how the children of assassinated or short-serving presidents sometimes found ways to continue shaping national policy long after their father's time in office had ended. Some accounts suggest his rise within Roosevelt's cabinet also served as a quiet symbolic gesture, honoring a presidency cut short by violence decades earlier. Unlike many presidential children who faded from public life, James R. Garfield carved out a distinguished career rooted in genuine policy contributions, rather than inherited fame alone. His path illustrates how the legacies of presidential families could extend well beyond their fathers' administrations, occasionally reshaping the very government their fathers once led. 61. And speaking of presidential fathers who carried private grief long before reaching the White House, Chester Arthur endured the loss of his only son in infancy years before his political career reached its highest point. Historical records suggest this early tragedy remained a quiet, largely unspoken part of Arthur's personal history, rarely discussed publicly during his time in office. Some historians note that losses of this kind were tragically common in 19th century America, when infant mortality touched families regardless of wealth or social standing. Arthur, known for his reserved and somewhat private demeanor, reportedly carried this loss with him throughout his later years, even as he balanced the demands of public service. Accounts suggest the grief may have shaped his generally guarded approach to discussing family matters, a trait that carried into his presidency following the assassination of James Garfield. Because so little was recorded about this personal loss, historians caution against drawing overly definitive conclusions about its lasting impact. Still, the quiet sorrow behind Arthur's public composure offers a reminder that even presidents who appeared distant or formal often carried private heartbreak few Americans ever knew about. 62. And speaking of presidential children who grew into influential figures long after leaving the White House, Chester Arthur's daughter Ellen, often called Nell, was still a child during her father's presidency, but later became known as a prominent Washington hostess. Historical accounts suggest Ellen's childhood years in the White House gave her early exposure to the social and political rhythms of the Capitol, shaping her later reputation for hosting notable gatherings. Some historians note that Ellen maintained a lower public profile than many presidential children, likely due to her young age during her father's time in office. As she matured, however, accounts describe her as a graceful figure within Washington social circles, respected for her poise and connections to the Capitol's elite. Her father, who took particular care in her upbringing following her mother's earlier death, reportedly valued her well-being deeply throughout his presidency. While detailed records of her adult social life remain somewhat limited, her enduring presence within Washington society reflects how presidential children sometimes carried their family's legacy forward in subtle, understated ways. Ellen Arthur's story quietly illustrates how a childhood spent within the White House could shape a lifetime of social influence long after the political spotlight had moved elsewhere. 63. And speaking of presidential children born under truly rare circumstances, Esther Cleveland made history in 1893 as the first child of a sitting president born inside the White House itself. Grover Cleveland, serving his second non-consecutive term, welcomed Esther during a period of significant economic uncertainty as the country grappled with a serious financial panic that year. Some historians note that Esther's birth offered a brief moment of personal joy for the Cleveland family amid otherwise turbulent political circumstances. Accounts suggest the event drew considerable public curiosity, given how unusual it was for a presidential child to be born within the residence traditionally associated with governance rather than family life. Because record-keeping around such private family matters was still evolving, some details about the birth remain limited to second-hand historical accounts. Nevertheless, Esther's arrival became a notable footnote in presidential history, often cited whenever discussions turned to firsts associated with the American presidency. Her birth inside the White House remains one of the more distinctive examples of how personal and political life intertwined within that historic residence, offering a rare glimpse into the private side of a presidency, largely remembered for economic hardship. 64. And speaking of presidential children whose names became unexpectedly tied to popular culture, Ruth Cleveland has long been associated with the origin of the Baby Ruth candy bar, though the company that created it publicly disputed this connection. Some historical accounts suggest the timing of the candy's release aligned closely enough with Ruth's public visibility as a presidential daughter to fuel popular assumptions about its naming. However, the Curtis Candy Company maintained that the bar was named independently, a claim some historians view skeptically given the convenient timing and lack of any other publicly known Baby Ruth during that era. Because Ruth Cleveland passed away years before the candy bar's introduction, questions about the company's motivations have persisted, with some suggesting the ambiguous origin story allowed them to avoid licensing fees tied to using a real public figure's name. Despite the controversy, definitive evidence supporting either version of the story remains elusive, leaving the true origin somewhat unresolved. This blend of nostalgia, commercial branding, and presidential family history illustrates how even minor cultural artifacts can become tangled with unverified historical claims. Ruth Cleveland's legacy, whether accurately tied to the candy bar or not, remains a curious example of presidential children unintentionally becoming part of American folklore. 65. And speaking of presidential families experiencing significant growth during and after their time in the White House, Frances Cleveland gave birth to 5 children throughout her marriage to Grover Cleveland, including 2 daughters born during his presidential terms. Historical accounts suggest Frances balanced the demands of public life with the responsibilities of raising a growing family, a task made more complex by the unusual structure of Cleveland's non-consecutive presidency. Some historians note that her relatively young age when she became First Lady drew considerable public attention, adding further scrutiny to her family life throughout both administrations. As the children grew, accounts suggest the family maintained a fairly private home life, shielding much of their day-to-day experiences from public exposure whenever possible. Frances herself remained a popular and closely watched public figure, with her family's growth often reported as a point of public interest during an era when presidential families received increasing media attention. While detailed accounts of each child's early years remain limited, their births collectively mark a period of substantial personal change for the Cleveland family. This steady expansion of their household offers a quieter, more domestic counterpart to the political turbulence that defined much of Cleveland's time in national office. 66. And speaking of presidential daughters who stepped into unexpected public roles, Mary Harrison McKee served as White House hostess after her mother, Caroline Harrison, became seriously ill during Benjamin Harrison's presidency. Historical accounts suggest Mary took on these responsibilities with considerable grace, managing social obligations during an especially difficult period for the family. Some historians note that Caroline's declining health placed significant strain on the household, making Mary's willingness to step forward all the more notable, given the emotional weight of the situation. As her mother's condition worsened, accounts suggest Mary balanced her hostess duties with the more personal responsibility of supporting her ailing parent, a dual role that likely proved emotionally exhausting. Caroline Harrison ultimately passed away before the end of her husband's term, making Mary's contributions during this period historically significant, even though they stemmed from tragic circumstances. Her willingness to assume such responsibilities reflects a broader pattern seen throughout presidential history, where family members often stepped in during moments of personal crisis. Mary Harrison McKee's brief but meaningful role as White House hostess remains a quiet example of resilience within a family, navigating profound grief under the intense scrutiny of public life. 67. And speaking of presidential children whose personal choices occasionally complicated their father's public image, Russell Harrison, son of Benjamin Harrison, found himself the subject of public attention due to his divorces during a period when such matters were far more scandalous than they are today. Historical accounts suggest Russell's personal life drew scrutiny from newspapers, eager to connect his private struggles to his father's political standing. Some historians note that presidential families of this era often faced heightened judgment as divorce carried significant social stigma throughout much of the 19th century. Russell reportedly tried to maintain a level of privacy, though his prominence as a president's son made that difficult, especially as reporters searched for any angle that might reflect on the administration. Accounts suggest Benjamin Harrison rarely commented publicly on his son's personal affairs, preferring to keep family matters separate from politics whenever possible. Still, the persistent public interest in Russell's divorces occasionally created uncomfortable moments for a presidency already navigating complex political challenges. His story offers a quiet reminder that even in earlier eras, presidential children were not immune to the kind of personal scrutiny that continues to follow public families well into modern times. 68. And speaking of presidential households that expanded through quiet acts of family responsibility, William and Ida McKinley took in Ida's orphaned niece, Catherine Saxton, raising her as their own foster daughter. Historical accounts suggest this decision reflected the close family ties within the Saxton household, particularly following the loss of Catherine's parents at a young age. Some historians note that taking in relatives during times of hardship was a fairly common practice throughout the 19th century, especially within families of comfortable means. Catherine's arrival reportedly brought a new dynamic to the McKinley household, offering companionship during a period marked by Ida McKinley's ongoing health struggles. Accounts suggest William McKinley treated Catherine with warmth and genuine paternal care, integrating her fully into the family's daily life long before his political career reached its peak. Because detailed records of Catherine's early years remain somewhat limited, historians caution against overstating specific details of her upbringing. Still, her presence within the McKinley family illustrates how personal loss and familial duty often intersected quietly behind the scenes of prominent political households, shaping relationships that would later carry into the far more public setting of the White House itself. 69. And speaking of unexpected caretaking roles within presidential families, Catherine Saxton's responsibilities grew significantly once William McKinley became president, as she reportedly helped care for her aunt, Ida McKinley, whose health remained fragile throughout much of his presidency. Historical accounts suggest Catherine's presence provided both practical assistance and emotional support, easing some of the burden placed on White House staff tasked with managing Ida's condition. Some historians note that Ada McKinley experienced ongoing health challenges, including seizures which required consistent attention and care from those closest to her. Catherine reportedly accompanied the presidential couple during various official functions, offering quiet support in settings that could otherwise prove physically taxing for Ida. Accounts suggest this arrangement allowed Ida to maintain a degree of public presence despite her health struggles, thanks in part to Catherine's steady involvement. Because much of this caretaking occurred privately, detailed accounts remain somewhat limited, leaving historians to rely on secondhand descriptions of daily life within the McKinley White House. Still, Catherine's role highlights how extended family members sometimes became essential, if quietly unrecognized figures within the demanding and closely watched environment of presidential life. 70. And speaking of presidential households known for lively, energetic atmospheres, Theodore Roosevelt's 6 children turned the White House into one of the most spirited residences in presidential history. Historical accounts suggest the Roosevelt children brought pets, games, and elaborate practical jokes into the mansion, creating an environment far removed from the more formal households of previous administrations. Some historians note that animals ranging from ponies to snakes reportedly made appearances within the White House during this period, much to the amusement and occasional alarm of staff. Accounts suggest Theodore Roosevelt, despite his demanding responsibilities, encouraged this lively atmosphere, viewing vigorous play as an important part of childhood development. The children's antics reportedly included sliding down staircases on trays and staging elaborate indoor games that tested the patience of household staff. Because first-hand accounts vary somewhat in detail, historians caution against treating every anecdote as fully verified, though the general reputation for chaos remains well documented. This spirited household dynamic offered a striking contrast to the formality typically associated with presidential families, reinforcing Roosevelt's broader reputation as a president who embraced energy, adventure, and a somewhat unconventional approach to both governance and family life. 71. And speaking of presidential children who became genuine celebrities in their own right, Alice Roosevelt captured widespread public fascination during her father's presidency, becoming one of the most talked about young women in the country. Historical accounts suggest Alice's bold personality, fashionable style, and independent attitude made her a frequent subject of newspaper coverage, often overshadowing more traditional political news. Some historians note that her popularity grew so significant that Theodore Roosevelt reportedly joked he could either run the country or manage Alice, but not both simultaneously. Accounts suggest Alice embraced her public visibility, engaging in behavior considered unconventional for a young woman of her era, including smoking in public and placing bets openly. Her outspoken nature reportedly created occasional tension within the family, though Roosevelt generally tolerated her independence with a mixture of exasperation and pride. Because much of the coverage surrounding Alice blended fact with exaggerated tabloid-style reporting, historians caution against accepting every anecdote at face value. Still, her undeniable influence on public perception of presidential families marked a notable shift, foreshadowing the increased media attention that future presidential children would continue to experience throughout the 20th century. 72. And speaking of presidential families who experienced profound loss tied to global conflict, Theodore Roosevelt's youngest son, Quentin, was killed in 1918 while serving as a pilot in the U.S. Army Air Service during World War I. Historical accounts suggest Quentin's death deeply affected his father, who had long expressed pride in his children's willingness to serve their country, despite the inherent dangers of military life. Some historians note that Roosevelt, though known publicly for his robust and energetic persona, reportedly struggled privately with grief following his son's death, a loss that some accounts suggest weighed heavily on him for the remainder of his life. Quentin's plane was shot down during aerial combat over France, a stark reminder of the emerging dangers associated with early 20th century warfare. Accounts suggest the loss affected not only Roosevelt but the broader family, as Quentin had been regarded as one of the more spirited and adventurous of the Roosevelt children. Because official military records from this period remain the primary source of documentation, historians generally treat the basic details of his death as well established. Quentin's death remains a somber reminder of the personal sacrifices sometimes borne by presidential families during times of war. 73. And speaking of presidential pets that found their way into unexpected corners of the White House, Archie Roosevelt's pony Algonquin became one of the more memorable animal residents of Theodore Roosevelt's household. Historical accounts suggest that when Archie fell ill and was confined to his bed, his older siblings hatched a plan to lift his spirits by bringing Algonquin directly to him. Some historians note that this reportedly meant walking the pony into the White House elevator and up to the second floor, a scene that must have startled staff unaccustomed to livestock traveling through the mansion's private quarters. Accounts suggest the pony behaved surprisingly well throughout the ordeal, standing patiently beside Archie's bed as the rest of the family looked on with amusement. Because much of this story comes from family retellings rather than official records, historians caution that certain details may have been embellished over the years for entertainment value. Still, the basic outline of the event has remained consistent across multiple accounts, reinforcing the Roosevelt family's reputation for unconventional household antics. Whether exaggerated or not, the image of a pony riding a White House elevator has become one of the more enduring anecdotes associated with Theodore Roosevelt's unusually lively family life, a fitting symbol of just how far normal rules bend inside that particular administration. 74. And speaking of presidential children who continued exploring the world well after their father left office, Kermit Roosevelt joined Theodore Roosevelt on the Smithsonian Roosevelt African Expedition, a lengthy scientific journey undertaken shortly after the elder Roosevelt's presidency concluded. Historical accounts suggest the expedition aimed to collect specimens for the Smithsonian Institution, resulting in an extensive collection of animals, plants, and geological samples gathered across various regions of Africa. Some historians note that Kermit's involvement went beyond simple companionship, as he reportedly contributed meaningfully to the logistical and scientific aspects of the journey, drawing on skills he had developed through his own interest in exploration. Accounts suggest the trip strengthened the bond between father and son, offering shared experiences that extended well beyond the confines of formal politics. The expedition faced numerous physical challenges, including difficult terrain and unpredictable wildlife encounters, testing the endurance of everyone involved. Because record-keeping from expeditions of this era can vary in detail and accuracy, historians caution against treating every published account as entirely precise. Still, the journey remains well documented through Roosevelt's own writings, offering insight into a chapter of presidential family life, defined less by governance and more by adventure, curiosity, and a shared appetite for exploring the wider natural world. 75. And speaking of presidential children who built substantial political careers of their own, Robert A. Taft, son of William Howard Taft, became one of the most influential Republican senators of the mid-20th century. Historical accounts suggest Robert developed a reputation for staunch conservative principles, often positioning himself as a leading voice against expansive federal government programs during his lengthy Senate career. Some historians note that his political philosophy earned him the nickname Mr. Republican, reflecting his significant influence within party circles throughout several decades. Accounts suggest Robert pursued the presidency himself on multiple occasions, seeking the Republican nomination though never ultimately securing it. His career reportedly built upon the foundation laid by his father's own political and judicial accomplishments, though Robert carved out a distinct identity focused primarily on legislative rather than executive influence. Because political assessments of Robert Taft's legacy vary depending on ideological perspective, historians generally encourage examining his record with appropriate nuance rather than treating any single characterization as definitive. Still, his prominence within American political history remains well established, illustrating how the Taft family's influence extended well beyond William Howard Taft's own presidency and judicial service, shaping Republican politics for a generation that followed. 76. And speaking of presidential daughters who pursued distinguished academic paths, Helen Taft Manning, daughter of William Howard Taft, built a respected career as a historian and educator at Bryn Mawr College. Historical accounts suggest Helen developed a strong interest in scholarship from an early age, eventually earning advanced degrees that allowed her to pursue serious academic work well beyond the expectations often placed on women of her era. Some historians note that she became a professor of history and later served in significant administrative roles at Bryn Mawr, contributing to the institution's academic reputation over several decades. Accounts suggest Helen balanced her professional ambitions with family life, managing both scholarly responsibilities and personal commitments during a period when such balance remained relatively uncommon for women in academia. Her work reportedly focused on European history, reflecting rigorous training and a genuine passion for historical inquiry rather than simple family prestige. Because detailed records of her specific academic contributions can be somewhat limited outside institutional archives, historians generally rely on Bryn Mawr's own documentation to assess her impact. Still, Helen's career stands as a notable example of a presidential child forging an independent professional identity, demonstrating that influence from a famous family name did not define the entirety of her personal accomplishments. 77. And speaking of presidential families who hosted significant personal milestones within the White House itself, Woodrow Wilson's daughter Eleanor married William Gibbs McAdoo in a ceremony held there in 1914. Historical accounts suggest the wedding drew considerable public attention, occurring during a period when Wilson's presidency faced mounting international tensions tied to the outbreak of World War I in Europe. Some historians note that the ceremony offered a brief moment of personal celebration amid an otherwise demanding political climate, providing the Wilson family with a rare opportunity to focus on family matters rather than pressing national concerns. Accounts suggest the marriage connected Wilson's family directly to his cabinet, since McAdoo served as Secretary of the Treasury at the time, creating an unusually close blending of personal and political relationships within the administration. The wedding reportedly followed the established tradition of prior White House ceremonies, drawing public curiosity similar to earlier presidential family weddings. Because press coverage from this era occasionally blended factual reporting with sentimental embellishment, historians caution against treating every detail as fully precise. Still, the event remains a well-documented example of how presidential families sometimes merged personal milestones with the political environment surrounding them, illustrating the unusual overlap between private life and public office. 78. And speaking of presidential children who pursued creative passions before turning toward entirely different paths, Margaret Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's eldest daughter, worked professionally as a singer before eventually relocating to India later in life. Historical accounts suggest Margaret possessed genuine musical talent, performing concerts that reportedly included charitable fundraising efforts connected to causes she cared about during and after her father's presidency. Some historians note that her performances received respectful attention, though her musical career remained relatively modest compared to more prominent professional performers of the era. Accounts suggest Margaret eventually sought a different sense of purpose later in life, leading her towards spiritual pursuits that ultimately brought her to an ashram in India, where she spent her remaining years. This shift reportedly reflected a deep personal search for meaning that extended well beyond the expectations typically placed on presidential children. Because detailed records of her spiritual journey remain somewhat limited outside personal correspondence, historians generally approach specific details with appropriate caution. Still, Margaret's path from public performance to a quiet life abroad illustrates the varied and sometimes unexpected directions taken by presidential children once released from the immediate spotlight of their father's administration, each shaping a distinctly personal legacy of their own. 79. And speaking of presidential daughters who carried their father's progressive instincts into their own adult lives, Jessie Wilson Sayre, another of Woodrow Wilson's three daughters, became known for her dedication to social reform and women's rights advocacy. Historical accounts suggest Jessie developed a strong interest in charitable and civic work well before her father's presidency ended, reportedly influenced by the broader progressive movement shaping American politics during that era. Some historians note that she remained active in organizations focused on women's suffrage and social welfare, using her visibility as a presidential daughter to draw attention to causes she believed in. Accounts suggest her marriage to Francis Bowes Sayre did little to slow her civic involvement, as she continued participating in reform efforts throughout much of her adult life. Her work reportedly reflected genuine personal conviction rather than simple political obligation, distinguishing her from family members who avoided public advocacy altogether. Because detailed records of her specific organizational contributions can be somewhat fragmented across archives, historians generally approach the finer points with some caution. Still, Jessie's engagement with progressive causes illustrates how some presidential children use their platform meaningfully, extending their father's reformist legacy into tangible efforts on behalf of women and social welfare, long after Wilson's time in office concluded. 80. And speaking of presidential marriages that took an unusual shape within the family tree, Warren Harding and his wife Florence never had children together during their marriage, though Florence brought a son from an earlier relationship into the household dynamic. Historical accounts suggest Florence's first marriage ended before she wed Harding, leaving her son largely raised outside the direct presidential spotlight that later surrounded her second husband. Some historians note that Harding's presidency itself became overshadowed by numerous personal scandals, complicating any lasting public narrative about his family life. Accounts suggest the absence of children from the marriage occasionally fueled public speculation, though contemporary sources rarely explored the matter with much depth or sensitivity. Because much of Harding's personal history remains clouded by controversy surrounding his administration, historians generally treat claims about his private life with appropriate caution. Still, the lack of a shared child between Warren and Florence Harding stands as a notable footnote within presidential family history, particularly compared to the larger, more prominently documented families that both preceded and followed his relatively brief and turbulent time in the White House, offering yet another reminder that not every presidential household followed a conventional or fully documented family structure. 81. And speaking of tragedies that struck presidential families with sudden and devastating speed, Calvin Coolidge Jr. developed a fatal infection after a seemingly minor blister formed while he played tennis on the White House grounds. Historical accounts suggest the injury appeared harmless at first, with young Coolidge continuing his normal activities before infection rapidly spread through his bloodstream. Some historians note that this occurred before the widespread availability of antibiotics, meaning treatments that might easily resolve such an infection today simply didn't exist at the time. Accounts suggest President Coolidge was profoundly affected by his son's sudden death, reportedly stating that something in him died as well when his son passed away. The tragedy occurred while Coolidge was actively serving as president, adding an especially painful layer of public grief to what remained a deeply private loss. Because personal reflections from Coolidge himself remain somewhat limited in written form, historians generally rely on secondhand accounts to understand the emotional toll this event carried. Still, the sudden loss of Calvin Coolidge Jr. stands as one of the more sobering reminders of how quickly ordinary childhood mishaps could turn fatal in an era before modern medical intervention, even within the protected walls of the White House itself. 82. And speaking of presidential children who moved quietly into stable business careers following personal tragedy, John Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge's surviving son, pursued a long and steady professional path within the corporate world after his brother's untimely death. Historical accounts suggest John worked across various business ventures throughout his life, eventually securing positions on several corporate boards that offered him a measure of financial and professional stability. Some historians note that John generally avoided the public spotlight that often surrounded other presidential children, choosing instead a comparatively private life removed from politics altogether. Accounts suggest this preference for privacy may have stemmed partly from the emotional weight of losing his brother at a young age, shaping his desire for a quieter, more predictable existence. His business career reportedly spanned several decades, reflecting steady professional growth rather than dramatic public achievement. Because detailed records of his specific corporate roles remain somewhat scattered across business archives, historians generally approach the finer details with some caution. Still, John Coolidge's path illustrates how not every presidential child sought influence or visibility, with some instead finding personal fulfillment through steady, private careers far removed from the pressures and expectations tied to their father's political legacy within American public life. 83. And speaking of presidential children whose early lives were marked by significant personal loss, Herbert Hoover's sons, Herbert Jr. and Allen, were partially raised by relatives following their mother's death. Historical accounts suggest this arrangement reflected the practical challenges Hoover faced balancing demanding professional responsibilities with the emotional needs of two young sons navigating profound grief. Some historians note that extended family members stepped in to provide stability during this difficult period, helping maintain some semblance of normalcy despite the circumstances. Accounts suggest both boys eventually developed close, functional relationships with their father, despite the disruptions experienced during childhood. Because detailed personal records from this period remain somewhat limited, historians generally rely on family correspondence to piece together the specifics of their upbringing. Still, the arrangement illustrates how even prominent political families weren't immune to the disruptions caused by personal tragedy, requiring flexible and often improvised solutions to ensure children received adequate care and support during formative years, regardless of their father's growing public profile and eventual rise toward the American presidency. 84. And speaking of presidential sons who built genuinely impressive careers, grounded in technical expertise, Herbert Hoover Jr. became a respected engineer whose work contributed meaningfully to early developments in aviation and radio technology. Historical accounts suggest he pursued formal engineering education that provided the foundation for a career spanning multiple technical industries throughout his professional life. Some historians note that his contributions to radio direction finding technology proved particularly significant, supporting advancements that influenced both civilian and military applications during a period of rapid technological growth. Accounts suggest Hoover Jr. later applied his technical background toward diplomatic and governmental roles, eventually serving in positions related to foreign policy despite his engineering origins. Because detailed technical records from this era can be scattered across specialized archives, historians generally approach specific claims about his individual contributions with reasonable caution. Still, Herbert Hoover Jr.'s career illustrates how presidential children sometimes pursued entirely independent professional identities rooted in genuine expertise rather than political ambition, demonstrating that meaningful contributions to American innovation could emerge from family backgrounds otherwise defined primarily by public service and executive political leadership within the highest levels of government. 85. And speaking of presidential families that grew large enough to fill an entire White House wing, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt had 6 children together, though their firstborn son tragically died in infancy before reaching even a year old. Historical accounts suggest this early loss deeply affected both parents, shaping the way they approached raising their remaining 5 children throughout the following years. Some historians note that the sheer size of the Roosevelt family made privacy nearly impossible, with each child eventually navigating public attention in strikingly different ways as adults. Accounts suggest the surviving children grew up amid constant scrutiny, particularly once their father's political career accelerated toward the presidency itself. Because detailed personal records from the family's early years remain somewhat fragmented, historians generally approach specific claims about individual upbringing with some caution. Still, the Roosevelt children collectively represent one of the more extensively documented presidential families in American history, offering researchers a rare, if imperfect, window into how one household balanced personal tragedy, public visibility, and the demands of raising multiple children destined to live much of their lives under intense national observation. 86. And speaking of presidential sons who pursued political careers of their own, James Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's eldest child, eventually served in Congress, representing California, after building a career that extended well beyond his father's shadow. Historical accounts suggest James initially worked in business and insurance before gravitating toward politics later in life, drawing on both his family name and personal ambition. Some historians note that he later changed political parties, a shift that reportedly surprised some observers given his family's strong Democratic identity. Accounts suggest James remained active in public life for decades, navigating both the advantages and burdens that came with being a former president's son. Because detailed records of his specific policy positions can be scattered across congressional archives, historians generally approach finer claims about his voting record with reasonable caution. Still, James Roosevelt's political career illustrates how presidential children sometimes chose to enter public service directly, testing whether their family name would help or hinder their own independent political ambitions within a system that often viewed them through the lens of their famous parent. 87. And speaking of presidential sons whose interests ranged far beyond conventional careers, Elliott Roosevelt pursued aviation, ranching, and writing throughout a life that seemed determined to explore as many fields as possible. Historical accounts suggest Elliott developed a genuine passion for flying, reportedly serving in a military capacity connected to aviation during a period when the field remained relatively new and rapidly evolving. Some historians note that he also tried his hand at ranching and later turned to writing, producing books that touched on both his family experiences and broader historical topics. Accounts suggest Elliott's personal life attracted considerable media attention, including multiple marriages that kept him frequently in the public eye. Because detailed records of his various business ventures remain somewhat inconsistent across sources, historians generally approach specific claims about his financial success with caution. Still, Elliott Roosevelt's varied pursuits illustrate how some presidential children resisted settling into a single defined path, instead sampling multiple careers while living under the intense and often unforgiving attention that came with being a former president's son during a rapidly changing 20th century. 88. And speaking of presidential sons who served their country during wartime rather than simply observing from a distance, John Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's youngest child, served with the United States Navy during World War II and reportedly went ashore at Omaha Beach during the D-Day invasion. Historical accounts suggest John's military service placed him directly within one of the most significant and dangerous operations of the entire war, despite his father occupying the presidency at the time. Some historians note that John generally avoided drawing attention to his wartime record, preferring a quieter public profile compared to some of his siblings. Accounts suggest he later pursued a business career after the war concluded, eventually working in fields largely unrelated to politics or government service, because detailed personal accounts of his specific wartime experiences remain somewhat limited. Historians generally rely on official military records to piece together the broader outline of his service. Still, John Roosevelt's presence at such a pivotal wartime moment illustrates how presidential children sometimes face genuine danger themselves, participating directly in historical events rather than merely watching them unfold from the safety of Washington. 89. And speaking of presidential daughters who pursued creative careers rather than political ones, Margaret Truman, Harry Truman's only child, became a singer, author, and radio personality after growing up almost entirely within the public eye. Historical accounts suggest Margaret initially pursued a career as a professional singer, performing concerts that drew considerable media attention largely due to her father's position as president. Some historians note that she later transitioned toward writing, eventually publishing numerous books, including biographies and mystery novels that achieved reasonable commercial success. Accounts suggest Margaret also worked in radio and television, further diversifying her public career well beyond her early musical ambitions. Because detailed critical assessments of her singing abilities vary considerably depending on the source, historians generally approach specific claims about her talent with appropriate caution. Still, Margaret Truman's career illustrates how presidential children sometimes built genuinely independent public identities, using their visibility not for political purposes, but for creative and professional pursuits that extended across multiple decades following her father's departure from the White House itself. 90. And speaking of presidential fathers who defended their children a little too fiercely, Harry Truman famously criticized a music critic after the reviewer published a harsh assessment of Margaret Truman's singing performance. Historical accounts suggest Truman personally wrote a sharply worded letter to the critic, reportedly threatening physical retaliation over what he viewed as an unfair attack on his daughter's abilities. Some historians note that the letter became public almost immediately, generating considerable media attention and mixed public reactions toward the sitting president's response. Accounts suggest Truman never expressed regret over the incident, reportedly viewing his reaction as an entirely justified defense of his daughter against unwarranted criticism. Because detailed records of the letter's exact wording occasionally vary slightly between sources, historians generally approach precise quotations with some caution. Still, the episode remains one of the more memorable examples of a president allowing personal, parental instincts to spill directly into public life, illustrating how even the highest office in the nation couldn't entirely separate Truman the president from Truman the fiercely protective father defending his only child. 91. And speaking of presidential sons who traded politics for diplomacy and military service, John Eisenhower pursued a career that combined both worlds, eventually serving as United States ambassador to Belgium after decades connected to military life. Historical accounts suggest John graduated from West Point and served during the Korean War, building a professional reputation somewhat separate from his father's towering legacy. Some historians note that Dwight Eisenhower reportedly worried about how comparisons to his own military career might affect his son's path, though John seemed determined to establish credibility through his own service record. Accounts suggest his later diplomatic appointment to Belgium reflected both his military background and his father's continued influence within Republican political circles. Because detailed records of his specific ambassadorial decisions remain somewhat scattered across diplomatic archives, Historians generally approach finer claims about his individual policy contributions with reasonable caution. Still, John Eisenhower's career illustrates how presidential children sometimes found meaningful public service paths that honored their family's military tradition while carving out distinct professional identities, proving that following in a famous father's footsteps didn't necessarily mean walking the exact same trail toward recognition and purpose within American public life. 92. And speaking of personal tragedies that quietly shaped presidential families long before the White House years, Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower's first son, Dowd, died of scarlet fever at just 3 years old, decades before Dwight ever became president. Historical accounts suggest the loss devastated both parents, reportedly leaving Mamie particularly heartbroken for years afterward, with the family rarely discussing the tragedy publicly. Some historians note that Dwight Eisenhower reportedly carried private grief over Dowd's death throughout his life, occasionally visiting his son's grave even during his presidency decades later. Accounts suggest this early loss may have influenced how the Eisenhowers approached raising their surviving son, John, though such psychological connections remain difficult to confirm definitively, because detailed personal records from that period remain understandably limited given the family's desire for privacy. Historians generally approach specific emotional claims with appropriate caution. Still, Dowd Eisenhower's death serves as a somber reminder that presidential families, like countless American families of the era, weren't immune to the era's harsh realities regarding childhood illness, illustrating a quieter, more painful chapter within a story otherwise dominated by military triumph and eventual political achievement on the world's largest stage. 93. And speaking of presidential daughters whose White House childhoods eventually led to significant public roles decades later, Caroline Kennedy grew up as a young child within the Kennedy White House before later serving as United States ambassador to Japan. Historical accounts suggest Caroline's early years attracted enormous public fascination, with images of her playing in the Oval Office becoming some of the era's most enduring photographs. Some historians note that her father's assassination when she was just 5 years old profoundly shaped her subsequent public life, though she largely avoided the spotlight throughout much of her adulthood. Accounts suggest Caroline eventually pursued law and writing before entering public service later in life, culminating in her diplomatic appointment during the Obama administration. Because detailed records of her specific diplomatic accomplishments remain relatively recent and still developing historically, historians generally approach broader assessments of her tenure with some caution. Still, Caroline Kennedy's journey from a toddler photographed beneath her father's desk to a formal representative of American diplomacy abroad illustrates how presidential children sometimes transform childhood visibility into genuine, substantive public service decades after the cameras first found them within those famous White House hallways. 94. And speaking of images that became permanently etched into American historical memory, John F. Kennedy Jr.'s salute at his father's funeral remains one of the most recognized and emotionally powerful photographs of the 20th century. Historical accounts suggest the moment occurred on his 3rd birthday, just days after his father's assassination, as the small boy stood beside his mother watching the funeral procession pass. Some historians note that John reportedly didn't fully understand the significance of the moment, with accounts suggesting Jacqueline Kennedy had quietly encouraged the gesture beforehand. Accounts suggest the photograph quickly became a defining symbol of national grief, reproduced endlessly across newspapers, magazines, and later historical retrospectives throughout subsequent decades. Because detailed records of the exact circumstances behind the salute occasionally vary slightly between sources, historians generally approach precise narrative details with reasonable caution. Still, that single photographed moment illustrates how presidential children sometimes became unwitting symbols of much larger national experiences, their private grief transformed into shared public memory, forever linking a small child's simple gesture to one of America's most sorrowful and closely documented historical tragedies. 95. And speaking of presidential weddings that turned the White House into a genuine celebration venue, Linda Bird Johnson married Marine Captain Charles Robb inside the White House itself back in 1967. Historical accounts suggest the wedding attracted considerable media attention, occurring during the height of the Vietnam War, which added a layer of complexity given the groom's military status and impending deployment. Some historians note that the ceremony represented one of the more elaborate White House weddings in modern history, complete with extensive planning and significant public interest surrounding the event. Accounts suggest Linda and Charles later built a lasting marriage, with Rob eventually pursuing his own political career as governor and senator from Virginia. Because detailed records of specific wedding arrangements occasionally vary slightly between contemporary news sources, historians generally approach precise details with reasonable caution. Still, Linda Bird Johnson's White House wedding illustrates how presidential families sometimes merge deeply personal milestones with the nation's most iconic residents, transforming a private celebration into a moment of shared public significance, one that briefly softened wartime tensions with an image of hopeful, if temporarily distracting, domestic happiness. 96. And speaking of marriages that quietly connected two entirely different presidential families, Julie Nixon married David Eisenhower, grandson of Dwight Eisenhower, creating an unusual link between two prominent political dynasties. Historical accounts suggest the couple met years before either family reached the height of political prominence, with their relationship developing gradually throughout their college years. Some historians note that their eventual marriage in 1968 attracted considerable media fascination, given the striking symbolism of uniting the Nixon and Eisenhower names so directly. Accounts suggest the couple maintained a relatively private life afterward, with Julie later pursuing writing and journalism rather than direct political involvement herself. Because detailed records of their personal relationship largely remain limited to public statements and select interviews, historians generally approach deeper claims about their private life with appropriate caution. Still, Julie Nixon and David Eisenhower's marriage illustrates how presidential families occasionally intertwined in unexpected ways, blending two significant political legacies into a single household, offering historians a curious footnote where personal affection quietly bridged two administrations that might otherwise have remained entirely separate chapters within America's broader presidential history. 97. And speaking of presidential children whose White House years were surprisingly ordinary, despite extraordinary surroundings, Amy Carter was just 9 years old when her father Jimmy Carter took office, and she attended a regular Washington public school rather than an exclusive private academy. Historical accounts suggest this decision reflected the Carters' broader efforts to present their family as relatable and grounded, even while living inside the White House itself. Some historians note that Amy occasionally brought her books to state dinners, an image that became somewhat iconic of her independent, unbothered personality during those years. Accounts suggest she later became known for activism during her college years, participating in protests that occasionally drew media attention completely separate from her father's political legacy. Because detailed records of her specific daily school experiences remain relatively limited to scattered contemporary news coverage, historians generally approach finer personal details with reasonable caution. Still, Amy Carter's choice to attend public school illustrates how some presidential families actively resisted the isolating bubble that often surrounds White House children, opting instead for an experience that mirrored, however imperfectly, the lives of millions of other American kids sitting in classrooms across the country, proving that even a 9-year-old living behind those famous gates could still carry a normal backpack to a normal school most mornings. 98. And speaking of presidential parents who went to unusual lengths to shield their child from constant public scrutiny, Bill and Hillary Clinton worked deliberately to protect Chelsea's privacy throughout her adolescent years inside the White House. Historical accounts suggest the Clintons made explicit requests to media outlets, asking that Chelsea's schooling and personal life largely remained off-limits to reporters during her formative teenage years. Some historians note that this approach represented a noticeable shift from earlier eras, when presidential children often faced near-constant press attention regardless of age or circumstance. Accounts suggest Chelsea attended a private school specifically chosen partly for its ability to offer a more insulated, secure environment away from constant cameras. Because detailed records of the family's specific privacy arrangements remain understandably limited given their personal nature, historians generally approach deeper claims about their exact strategies with appropriate caution. Still, the Clintons' efforts illustrate how presidential families increasingly recognize the psychological toll of growing up under a national microscope, choosing instead to carve out whatever ordinary adolescence remained possible within an extraordinary and highly visible household, a decision that arguably reshaped how future administrations approached balancing public interest with a child's basic right to a reasonably private, unremarkable coming of age. 99. And speaking of White House celebrations that blended personal happiness with historical significance, Susan Ford married Charles Vance inside the White House itself in 1975, during her father Gerald Ford's presidency. Historical accounts suggest the wedding took place in the East Room, continuing a long tradition of presidential children marrying within those historic walls. Some historians note that the ceremony offered a rare moment of light, celebratory attention during an otherwise turbulent period following Ford's unusual ascension to the presidency after Nixon's resignation. Accounts suggest Susan approached the wedding with relative openness toward media coverage, allowing photographs that captured a seemingly ordinary young couple beginning married life inside an extraordinary setting. Because detailed records of the marriage's later years remain somewhat limited within broader historical archives, historians generally approach specific claims about the couple's subsequent life with reasonable caution. Still, Susan Ford's White House wedding illustrates how presidential families, even during politically uncertain times, continued finding ways to mark personal milestones within America's most recognizable residents. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through 99 secrets surrounding the president's children, stories of privilege and privacy, ordinary school days and extraordinary weddings, reminding us that behind every historic address, real families quietly lived, loved, and occasionally slept soundly enough for the rest of us to finally do the same.